Hi there. I'm just a little cat trying to reach my first 1,000 subscribers. It's free. Just click subscribe right under this video. It would mean the world to me.
Thanksgiving dinner always had this performative, almost theatrical rhythm to it at my parents' house, where timing and image were everything. Carved turkey at precisely 4, cranberry sauce set in Grandma June's crystal bowl, and the napkins folded with such smug precision you'd think Martha Stewart herself was judging the presentation. I pulled into the driveway around 3:15, right on schedule, the sweet potato casserole I'd slaved over all morning still warm in the passenger seat, covered with a tight layer of foil. My chest already felt tight, not from the cold, but from what I knew was coming. Another long afternoon of polite smiles, passive-aggressive remarks, and pretending that everything in our family worked like a well-oiled machine instead of the emotionally rusted heap it really was. Susan pulled up exactly 4 minutes after me, in a brand new Range Rover, complete with oversized sunglasses and a dog that looked like it cost more than my last 3 paychecks combined. She opened the car door with a theatrical flourish, like she was stepping onto a red carpet, not a cracked driveway in suburban New Jersey. The moment she walked in, the mood shifted. My father's voice grew louder, cheerier, full of warmth I hadn't heard directed at me in years. "There she is, my real estate mogul," he bellowed, wrapping Susan in a bear hug that lifted her off the ground, while Mom fluttered around the kitchen like a spooked hen, trying to accommodate her beach house girl. I followed behind, casserole in hand, and for a moment no one even noticed. I stood there like an extra on my own stage, holding my offering like a kid at a bake sale no one wanted to visit. Finally, Mom glanced over with a distracted, "Oh good, put it near the stove," before turning her attention back to Susan's latest escapade in homeownership. Something about imported tile, sweeping ocean views, and a kitchen so open it basically merged with the sky. I kept quiet, not out of kindness, but because I'd learned over the years that any comment that didn't orbit around Susan like she was the sun itself was either dismissed or met with that gentle, pitying look from Dad that felt more like a pat on the head than actual conversation. Dinner was a parade of Susan's accomplishments. We toasted her business acumen, her impeccable taste, and her vision. Dad even raised a glass, an actual crystal flute, I kid you not, and proclaimed her the queen of coastal investment. The phrase made me want to slide under the table, maybe hide in the cabinet with the old board games no one touched anymore. Not once did anyone ask how work was going for me, or even bother to mention the fact that I just finished leading a successful marketing campaign for a regional healthcare brand. I could have stood up and announced I'd been recruited by NASA, and I think they still would have circled back to the new quartz countertops Susan was having installed next week. And yet I smiled. I refilled drinks. I passed the rolls. I complimented the stuffing even though it was dry as hell. I laughed on cue, let Susan show me photos on her phone like they were Renaissance masterpieces, even offered to help with her rental website copy, knowing full well she wouldn't take me up on it because I've got a guy for that. I played the part. But inside something was cracking, not in a dramatic throw my napkin down kind of way, but more like the quiet pop of a balloon slowly losing air, undetectable to everyone else, but loud as hell to me. When it came time for dessert, I retrieved the small, carefully wrapped envelope from my coat pocket and slid it beside Dad's plate while everyone else busied themselves with carving pumpkin pie. I said nothing, just smiled, and took a sip of wine. It wasn't much to look at. Just a standard white envelope, unassuming, no frills, but it carried weight. Inside was a document that had kept me up nights, the kind of thing that doesn't just disrupt dinner but changes the whole tone of the family. A financial file, to be precise. One I wasn't supposed to have. One that, if understood fully, would take the sparkle right out of Dad's eyes. He didn't open it right away. He just glanced at it and said, "Oh, you didn't have to, sweetheart," in that overly cheerful tone he used whenever he had no real interest in what you just handed him. I told him it was something simple, something I thought he might want to look at before the end of the night. He chuckled, always so mysterious, and set it aside as he leaned over to help Susan with the whipped cream. The laughter picked back up. Glasses clinked, Stories from past Thanksgivings, most of which had conveniently erased my contributions, were passed around like heirloom jewelry, and I sat there watching, letting it all roll past me. The thing about being invisible for so long is that you learn how to slip in and out of rooms without anyone noticing you were ever there. But this time, I didn't want to disappear. Not completely. I just wanted to make sure that when they finally did look in my direction, it would be for something they couldn't ignore. As the night wore on, people started to fade into the living room, full of wine and carbs and contented laughter. Dad, curious now, finally picked up the envelope. He turned it over once, twice, then tore into the flap like it was a birthday card. I didn't move. I didn't speak. I just watched. And in that moment, I saw it, the shift. His brows furrowed. The color drained a shade or two from his cheeks. The smile on his face froze like someone had hit pause on his expression. He looked up at me, then down again at the papers, and then back at me. I didn't blink, because for the first time in years, Dad wasn't ignoring me, and he had no idea what was coming next. I woke up the next morning before anyone else in the house had started to stir. The faint hum of the refrigerator, the only sound in the kitchen, as I sat at the counter with a lukewarm cup of coffee, trying to piece together the night before like a detective at a crime scene, reviewing every look, every pause, every word, or lack thereof, that had passed between me and my father after he opened that envelope. He hadn't said anything directly, not in front of the others, but his reaction had been sharp enough to cut through the performance. That forced joviality he wore like a mask every Thanksgiving, and for the first time in years, maybe decades, I felt like I'd cracked something in him. Something real, something long buried under smug holiday cheer and performative family pride. The envelope, the contents of which I had no right to possess, had been the product of quiet months of curiosity, turned resentment, turned full-on obsession, as I began to dig through old records, dusty filing cabinets, and one particularly careless email, left open on Dad's desktop the last time my houses sat for them. It wasn't just about the numbers, though the hidden offshore account was staggering in its quiet betrayal, but about the principle, the choices, the secrets held under the guise of protecting the family, while favoring one daughter so openly it was like I didn't even exist. That document was my answer to years of silent treatment disguised as oversight, my rebuttal to every time he told Susan she was doing so well for herself, while brushing past my accomplishments with a nod and a muttered, "Good for you, kiddo." By the time I heard footsteps overhead and the creak of the stairs under Susan's designer boots, I had composed myself enough to pour a second cup of coffee and rehearse my lines. Not that I planned to say much. I didn't need to. The silence between my father and me was now laced with something thicker than discomfort. It had weight, a gravitational pull that threatened to suck in the whole damn house. Mom entered next, her smile a little tighter than usual, her "Good morning, honey" coming out more like a question than a greeting. She didn't mention the envelope. Neither did I. Breakfast was a quiet affair, which would have been a novelty if it weren't for the lingering tension that floated above the pancakes and bacon. Like a dense fog, nobody wanted to acknowledge. Dad sat at the head of the table, reading the paper without actually turning a page for nearly 20 minutes, while Susan scrolled through her phone with a bright, clueless energy, oblivious to the storm that had begun to brew under the surface. She launched into a monologue about beach house furniture, some dispute with her decorator about reclaimed wood versus white lacquer, and how hard it was to find good contractors these days. And I watched Mom nod along, eyes flicking toward Dad now and then, like she wasn't sure if she should speak or just keep the peace. I took a bite of my toast, swallowed hard, then set down my fork with just enough emphasis to turn a few heads. "I was thinking," I said casually, "maybe later this weekend, Dad and I could have a little chat. Go over some paperwork." I didn't look at him when I said it. I didn't have to. The pause that followed was louder than any argument. He coughed into his coffee, murmured something about being busy this afternoon, and went back to pretending the classifieds were the most fascinating reading material in existence. Susan blinked, looked between us, then smiled that oblivious, performative smile of hers, and asked me if I wanted to help her pick curtains for the guest room at the beach house. The fact that she still thought that was an appropriate segue, or that I'd be remotely interested, made me want to laugh out loud, but I just shook my head and said I had other things to handle. She shrugged and went back to her phone. Of course she did. She never asked follow-up questions because it had never occurred to her that I might have a world of my own outside of hers. Later, when I passed Dad in the hallway, he didn't say anything at first, just adjusted his glasses and looked anywhere but at me. I leaned in, voice low enough not to carry, and said, "I have more than what I gave you. We can either talk about it now, or you can wait until the whole family finds out later." He froze, just for a second, but it was enough. I didn't need a response. I'd planted the seed, and I could already feel it starting to take root. By evening, the atmosphere had shifted. Mom was fussing in the kitchen more than usual, checking the oven and rechecking the wine glasses like she was trying to stay busy, stay useful. Susan had made plans to meet a friend for drinks and didn't invite me, not that I expected her to. Dad had retreated to his study, the door cracked open just enough for me to hear the faint rustle of paper and the creak of his old leather chair. He was reading it again, the document, the numbers, the names. The account in Belize he'd thought no one would ever trace. The beneficiary listed not as Mom, not even as Susan, but someone else entirely. A name that meant nothing to me, but everything to him. I didn't press. I didn't need to. I'd spent my entire life being the girl who made things easier, who didn't cause trouble, who let her sister have the spotlight, and who cleaned up after holiday dinners while the stars of the family took credit for harmony. I had carefully maintained. But something in me had changed. Not suddenly, but slowly, methodically, like a tide shifting under the surface until one day it crests and pulls the shore right out from under you. When I finally turned in for the night, the house was quiet again. Too quiet. But I knew tomorrow wouldn't be. I'd made sure of it. Because the thing about being invisible for so long is that when you finally decide to step into view, you don't do it with a whisper. You do it with thunder. The house was unusually quiet when I found myself standing in the dim light of Dad's study later that evening. The soft tick of the grandfather clock somewhere in the hallway. The only sound accompanying the tension that hung between us, thick and almost suffocating in its intensity. As he hesitated, fingers hovering over the envelope I had slipped him earlier that day. The small package that now seemed heavier than any suitcase, loaded with secrets I had no right to reveal, yet knew I had to if I wanted to break through the polished facade of our family's carefully constructed lies. I watched him because something in his expression and trait of vulnerability he rarely allowed himself to show, a flicker of panic beneath the practiced calm, as if he suddenly understood that the truth I was holding in my hands was a kind of reckoning neither of us could avoid. He unfolded the papers with trembling hands, the edges creasing beneath his grip as his eyes darted back and forth across the pages, reading numbers, account names, and transactions that I had pieced together from a mix of bank statements, an unguarded laptop, and countless hours of quiet research that no one suspected. The offshore accounts, hidden debts, and shell companies were all there. A financial web so tangled and secretive, it explained everything. The preferential treatment toward Susan, the hushed phone calls with attorneys, and the nights when Dad seemed distracted, weighed down by something heavier than work, stress, or aging bones, all the while insisting it was to protect us, to keep the family safe from the fallout of decisions made long ago. But instead it only kept us divided, with me left to wrestle in the shadows, invisible and ignored. His breath hitched, and for a moment, the strong man I had known all my life looked like a stranger, beaten and broken by the weight of the truth, unable to find the words to explain what I had just forced into the light. While I stood there, trying not to let my own emotions betray the satisfaction that flickered like a candle in the cold, wondering how we had come to this point where secrets were currency and love was measured in bank balances and favors. The silence stretched between us, thick and unforgiving, broken only when he finally said, his voice a mixture of anger, fear, and something that sounded dangerously like regret. "Where did you get this?" I didn't flinch, didn't back down, even though his gaze was sharp and accusing, the kind of look that usually made me clam up and retreat. But this time, I met it head on, steady and unwavering, because I had rehearsed this moment more times than I cared to admit. The countless nights I spent turning over the pieces of this puzzle in my mind, until I was certain I held the one thing that could shift the balance of power between us. "From the bank," I said evenly. "I found it in your safe." Dad's face tightened. His jaw clenched so hard I thought he might snap a tooth, and the room suddenly felt smaller, claustrophobic, like the walls were closing in to hear the confession he refused to speak aloud. It was then that I realized how fragile our family really was, built on unspoken agreements and silences louder than any argument, and how the cracks in that foundation had been growing for years, hidden beneath the surface of polite conversation and forced smiles. Before I could say anything more, the study door opened, and Mom stepped inside, her eyes wide and wary, the warmth that usually filled her presence replaced by an icy caution that made my skin prickle with unease. She didn't speak, but her glance between Dad and me said enough. This was not a conversation meant for the rest of the family to hear. At least not yet. I turned my attention back to Dad, who was now staring at the papers, as if they held the key to a secret he wished he could forget. The weight of his choices pressing down on him in a way I had never seen before. And for a moment, I saw the man behind the father, the flawed, fallible human being who had made mistakes and carried burdens in silence. The house was still quiet when I finally left the study, my footsteps echoing softly down the hall, leaving Dad behind with his secret laid bare, and a tension that promised to unravel everything we had pretended was fine for so long. I didn't know what the next day would bring, or how Mom and Susan would react when the truth inevitably slipped out, but I knew one thing for certain: nothing would ever be the same again, and I was ready to face whatever came next because, for once, I wasn't going to be the invisible daughter. The morning light slipped through the blinds with an unnatural stillness, casting long shadows across the kitchen where the silence was thick enough to choke on, and I found myself sitting at the breakfast table alone, save for the hum of the coffee maker and the faint clatter of dishes coming from the other room, as the tension that had been quietly building over the past few days finally began to settle like a storm cloud, hanging ominously over every word exchanged and every glance passed between the members of my fractured family. Mom moved through the kitchen with mechanical precision, setting out plates and refilling mugs without a word, her eyes avoiding mine like I carried a contagious illness, while Susan, seemingly unaware or purposefully indifferent to the shifting tides beneath her polished exterior, chattered away about the latest trends in beach house furnishings and how her designer was insisting on mixing reclaimed wood with high-gloss finishes, an obsession that seemed trivial against the backdrop of everything else simmering just beneath the surface. Dad's absence was the first thing I noticed. He had retreated to his study, that same sanctuary where the envelope had been opened and the carefully hidden financial truths exposed. A room that now felt like a prison for the secrets he could no longer keep buried. And the way he avoided the kitchen, avoided eye contact, was a tacit admission that the game had changed, that the quiet control he had exercised over our family dynamics was slipping through his fingers like sand. I sipped my coffee slowly, the bitter taste matching the cold knot forming in my stomach, as I realized the power of the document I held was growing exponentially, that what began as a quiet act of defiance was evolving into a calculated leverage that I intended to wield with precision and, if necessary, ruthlessness. The phone buzzed in my pocket with a message from an unknown number, and as I read the terse text from a local real estate attorney asking for confirmation on certain property disclosures related to Mom's name, I allowed myself a small dark smile because I knew exactly where this was headed. A subtle nudge, an invisible hand guiding the threads of a web that would soon begin to unravel at the edges, exposing the tangled mess of financial subterfuge that my father had spent years weaving to keep us apart and protect his own interests at the expense of our family's unity. The knowledge that I could disrupt the carefully maintained facade with just a few clicks, felt empowering, intoxicating even. And I realized that the revenge I had been craving was no longer about petty grudges or silent exclusion, but about reclaiming agency in a story where I had been written out for far too long. Throughout the day, I watched the subtle shifts in the household dynamics as Mom's calls became more frequent and her tone more guarded, as Susan's bright smiles flickered with unease when she caught snippets of hushed conversations between Dad and the lawyer, and as Dad himself began to avoid common spaces, retreating further into his study, as if to shield himself from the inevitable fallout. At one point, I passed him in the hallway and casually dropped a question as innocuous as it was pointed. "Have you thought about what happens if those disclosures come to light?" His response was a freeze, a pause that lasted longer than comfortable, followed by a muttered, "What are you talking about?" That sounded more like a plea than a denial. Later that evening, the family gathered for a quiet dinner, the usual banter replaced by a brittle tension that stretched across the table like an electric current ready to spark. And as I raised my glass in a toast, the clink against Dad's glass was met with a glance filled with a mixture of resignation and something darker, a tacit acknowledgement that the game was no longer mine alone to play, but had become a battlefield where every move counted and every secret threatened to become a weapon. Susan tried to break the silence with a forced joke about the beach house renovations, but it fell flat, swallowed by the weight of unspoken accusations and the lingering question of who would fall first when the truth finally caught up with us all. As the night wore on and the house settled into a restless quiet, I found myself alone again in the kitchen, the aftermath of the evening's tension settling around me like dust, and I realized that this was only the beginning, that the small, deliberate acts of disruption I had set in motion were the opening moves in a much larger game, one where the stakes were not just money or property, but the fragile bonds of family and the unspoken rules that had governed us for so long. The thought was both terrifying and exhilarating because for the first time in years, I felt like I was not just reacting to the world around me but shaping it, forcing it to confront truths that had been hidden in the shadows. And though I didn't know exactly where this path would lead, I was ready to walk it, whatever the cost. Thanksgiving had always been a performance, a ritual where smiles were exchanged like currency, and the weight of unspoken grievances was artfully masked behind laughter and carefully chosen words. But this year, as I walked into the house and took my place at the dining table, the atmosphere was different, thicker, heavier, charged with an electricity born from secrets laid bare and wounds still fresh beneath the surface. And as I looked around at the faces of my family, Dad with his usual reserved posture, now tinged with a vulnerability I had never seen before, Mom with her practiced calm that barely concealed the storm she was weathering inside, and Susan, whose confident facade seemed to flicker uncertainly as if the ground beneath her was no longer as solid as she had believed. I realized that this Thanksgiving would not be like any other because the truths we had avoided were now impossible to ignore, and the fragile ties that bound us were stretched taut, threatening to snap or finally hold us together in a way we never had before. The turkey sat at the center of the table, golden and fragrant, but the usual conversation about recipes, football, or neighborhood gossip felt strained and superficial against the backdrop of the tension that had seeped into every corner of the room. And when the glasses were filled and the first toast was offered, it was not to Susan's new beach house or her latest achievements, but to something far more complicated, a grudging acknowledgement of the cracks that had formed in our family's foundation and the uncomfortable truths that had forced us all to confront the consequences of silence and favoritism. I raised my glass with a steady hand, catching Dad's eye across the table, and as the room quieted, I spoke quietly but clearly. I thought about what we're really celebrating tonight. And maybe it's not just about the homes we build or the successes we flaunt, but about the secrets we keep and the stories we don't tell, because sometimes those stories are the ones that matter most. Dad's gaze faltered for the briefest moment, his lips pressing into a thin line before he nodded slowly, the proud mask he usually wore giving way to something softer, more human, as if the weight of his long-hidden mistakes was finally lifting enough to allow him to see us not just as children or heirs to a legacy, but as individuals shaped by truths that could no longer be buried in silence. Mom reached for her glass, her fingers trembling slightly as she offered a tentative smile, and even Susan, who had spent years basking in the spotlight, seemed to shrink back just a little, her usual bravado tempered by the realization that the narrative she had relied on was shifting in ways she hadn't anticipated. As the conversation unfolded, we skirted around the edges of the revelation, the offshore accounts, the hidden debts, and the fragile balance Dad had tried to maintain between protecting us and protecting himself. And though no one wanted to say it outright, the unspoken admission hung in the air like a specter, that our family had been built on compromises and secrets that had shaped who we were, for better or worse, and that perhaps the path forward required a reckoning, a willingness to face the past with honesty and vulnerability instead of denial and division. I listened as Dad spoke haltingly about his fears, his regrets, and the burden of trying to be both provider and protector in a world that demanded more than he felt capable of giving. And I realized that beneath the layers of anger and resentment, there was still a flicker of hope, for reconciliation, for understanding, and for a future that might be different from the one we had inherited. The final toast came quietly, without fanfare, but with a weight that settled over us all like a benediction and a challenge wrapped into one, as I lifted my glass and said, "To secrets, I guess, not always what you think." A phrase that captured the ambiguity of our situation and the complexity of the emotions swirling around the table, leaving space for both forgiveness and lingering questions, because some stories aren't neatly tied up in endings, but are instead ongoing conversations that we carry with us, sometimes reluctantly, sometimes with hope, into the uncertain tomorrows. As the glasses clinked softly and the room exhaled a breath it had been holding, I caught Dad's eye one last time and saw a flicker of pride mixed with sorrow, while Susan poured herself another glass of wine with a distracted sigh, and Mom reached across the table to squeeze my hand gently, a silent gesture that spoke volumes about the shifts happening beneath the surface, the realignment of our family's story that was just beginning. And as I sat back, the warmth of the wine spreading through me, I knew that while some questions remained unanswered and some wounds still raw, this Thanksgiving marked a turning point, a moment when the invisible daughter had stepped into the light, not with anger or vengeance, but with the quiet strength of someone who refused to be erased any longer. The house felt different that night, not because the past had been erased, but because the future was suddenly wide open, full of possibilities and dangers alike, and I found myself wondering, who would be brave enough to tell my story next Thanksgiving, and what secrets would they choose to reveal?